What if I told you that millions of Americans could wake up tomorrow without power, not because of a natural disaster, but because of a political move made by their closest ally? This is not speculation, it is a real possibility that could reshape the global energy landscape. For decades, the United States has relied on Canadian electricity to power key states like New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. But after recent trade tensions and economic conflicts, Canada has made a shocking threat, cutting off electricity exports. This move could trigger massive blackouts, economic disruption, and a shift in global energy strategy. In this video, we are breaking down how this crisis unfolded and what it means for the future. And trust me, some of the consequences will shock you. Stick with me to the end, because missing this could mean missing the biggest energy crisis of our time. What's happening? During a private dinner at Mar-a-Lago, the then President of the United States made an offhand comment that would soon ignite an international dispute. Turning to the Prime Minister of Canada, he jokingly suggested that Canada would be better off as the 51st state of the United States. While the remark may have been intended as lighthearted banter, it quickly took on a life of its own. Shortly after the dinner, the president took to his social media platform and referred to the Canadian leader as Governor of Canada. The post spread rapidly, fueling speculation and outrage on both sides of the border. What many assumed to be a passing remark was soon followed by a series of policy moves that suggested a more aggressive stance toward Canada. The administration of the United States imposed tariffs on Canadian goods, citing economic concerns and trade imbalances. At first, Canadian officials downplayed the remarks and the tariffs, choosing to respond through diplomatic channels. However, as the rhetoric intensified and economic pressure mounted, Canada began preparing a strategic response. Instead of engaging in direct verbal confrontations, Canadian officials worked behind the scenes to develop a countermeasure that would deliver a strong message without resorting to traditional diplomatic protests. One key sector emerged as the most effective leverage point: energy. The hidden dependency. The reliance of the United States on Canadian electricity is far greater than most people realize. For decades, Canadian power has silently flowed across the border, keeping millions of American homes, businesses, and industries running. While the general public may not give much thought to where their energy comes from, the truth is that several key states in the United States are deeply dependent on their northern neighbor to keep their grid stable and their cities illuminated. The states most vulnerable to a potential disruption include New York, Michigan, Minnesota, and the entire New England region. These areas receive a significant portion of their electricity from Canada, primarily from the hydroelectric power plants in Quebec and Manitoba. Without this steady supply, these states would be at severe risk of rolling blackouts, increased energy costs, and potential economic turmoil. The relationship between Canada and the United States in the energy sector has been built over many years. Hydroelectricity from Canada provides not only a reliable source of power, but also a more sustainable and environmentally friendly option compared to fossil fuels. With an abundance of natural water sources, Canada has been able to export electricity at competitive rates, making it an attractive partner for the energy-hungry states of the United States. Despite this long-standing partnership, the energy infrastructure in the United States remains highly vulnerable. The aging power grid, combined with increasing energy demands, makes the country particularly susceptible to supply disruptions. While domestic energy production exists, it is often not enough to meet peak demands, forcing the United States to rely on imports from Canada. This dependence has now become a major point of contention in the escalating trade tensions between the two countries. By linking the energy crisis directly to the United States' hidden reliance on Canadian electricity, Canada had found the perfect pressure point in the trade war. The question was no longer just about tariffs. It was about the potential consequences of a fractured energy partnership. The ultimate power play. In an unprecedented move, Canada announced counter tariffs totaling more than $155 billion on a wide range of American imports. However, the most shocking response came from Ontario, a province that supplies a substantial amount of electricity to the northeastern states of the United States. The Premier of Ontario issued a statement suggesting that if the economic attacks on Canada continued, the province would consider cutting power exports to the United States. This declaration sent shockwaves through the energy sector. While tariffs could be absorbed or negotiated, an abrupt halt in electricity exports would have immediate and devastating effects. Cities such as New York and Boston, both of which rely heavily on Canadian power, would be plunged into chaos. Factories in Michigan and Minnesota, already struggling with supply chain disruptions, would face shutdowns due to energy shortages. The cascading effects would ripple across industries, affecting everything from transportation to consumer goods production. Energy companies in the United States scrambled to assess the potential impact, while some some believed that Canada would not follow through on its threat, others were not so sure. The move was seen as a calculated escalation, one that demonstrated just how much leverage Canada held in the ongoing trade dispute. Unlike traditional economic sanctions, which often take time to manifest their full impact, an electricity cutoff would be felt almost immediately. As news of the potential energy shutdown spread, analysts began speculating on whether Canada would actually take such a drastic step. While it remained unclear whether the threat was meant as a bargaining tool or a genuine possibility, one thing was certain: the balance of power in the trade dispute had shifted. For the first time, the United States found itself vulnerable in a way it had not anticipated. The first signs of panic. The reaction from businesses and policymakers in the United States was swift. Major corporations, particularly those in manufacturing and heavy industry, began issuing warnings about the economic fallout that would result from an energy disruption. Some companies halted expansion plans, while others started looking for alternative sources of power, though viable options were limited. Power companies in the affected states began coordinating with federal and state governments in an attempt to prevent an energy crisis. Emergency meetings were held in Washington, where lawmakers debated possible responses. While some argued for immediate negotiations to de-escalate tensions, others pushed for retaliatory measures against Canada. The White House found itself in a difficult position. The administration had underestimated the strategic importance of Canadian electricity, and now it was facing mounting pressure from both political allies and business leaders to resolve the crisis. Energy security, a topic that had long been overshadowed by other political priorities, suddenly became the focal point of national discussion. Despite reassurances from officials that solutions were being explored, the reality was far more uncertain. Finding alternative power sources would take time, and the infrastructure required to replace Canadian electricity imports did not yet exist. The prospect of widespread blackouts, coupled with rising electricity across the country. As tensions continued to escalate, it became evident that this was no longer just a trade dispute. The energy war between Canada and the United States had begun, and its outcome would have lasting consequences for both nations. The question now was not just whether Canada would follow through on its threat, but how the United States would respond to a crisis it had never seen coming. Canada's next move, a shift to Asia. As tensions between the United States and Canada reached new heights, Canadian officials moved swiftly to explore alternative markets for their energy exports. Determined to reduce dependency on the United States, Canada finalized groundbreaking energy agreements with China and Japan. These agreements were not just about oil and gas, they signaled a major shift in Canada's economic strategy, aligning more closely with Asia's growing energy demand. The expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline marked a turning point. With its capacity nearly tripled, this infrastructure project allowed Canada to transport almost 1 million barrels of oil per day directly to the Pacific coast. From there, tankers could reach Asian markets faster than ever before. The timing could not have been better, as energy-hungry nations such as China and Japan were actively seeking stable suppliers in an era of increasing geopolitical uncertainty. Canadian officials emphasized that this shift was not merely a reaction to United States tariffs, but a long-term strategy for economic diversification. Over the years, a reliance on a single trade partner had proven to be a vulnerability. By building stronger relationships with Asian nations, Canada ensured that it would not be held hostage by political disputes in North America. For the United States, however, this shift raised significant concerns. With Canadian resources flowing to Asia, Washington faced the possibility of losing a crucial energy lifeline. The United States doubles down, but it backfires. Facing mounting pressure to assert dominance in trade negotiations, the administration in Washington responded aggressively. A new round of tariffs targeted Canadian industries even more harshly, escalating the trade war to unprecedented levels. This move was intended to force Canada back to the negotiating table under less favorable terms. Instead, it triggered an economic backlash within the United States itself. Businesses across the United States sounded the alarm. Major manufacturers, heavily dependent on Canadian raw materials, warned that production costs would skyrocket. The automobile industry, which had long relied on a seamless flow of parts across the border, faced immediate supply chain disruptions. Farmers also voiced their concerns, as Canada responded with its own countermeasures, restricting the import of key American agricultural products. The political ramifications were equally severe. Some Republican governors, recognizing the immediate economic fallout in their states, began negotiating directly with Canadian officials in an attempt to secure independent energy agreements. These quiet discussions signaled growing fractures within the administration in Washington. While some leaders supported the aggressive stance, others saw the tariffs as an unsustainable strategy that would do more harm than good. The political divide, America turns on itself. As the economic strain intensified, the political divide within the United States became more pronounced. Governors from energy-dependent states pushed for alternative solutions, openly challenging federal policies. Some states explored legal measures to bypass the tariffs altogether, arguing that energy security was too critical to be used as a bargaining chip in a trade war. The division extended to Congress, where debates became increasingly heated. One faction pushed for aggressive economic pressure, arguing that Canada would eventually concede. Others, however, recognized the risks of prolonged hostility and advocated for a diplomatic resolution. The business community added to the pressure, as corporations launched lobbying efforts to demand an end to the trade war. Inside the White House, power struggles became evident. Key advisors clashed over the best path forward, with some insisting on doubling down, while others warned that the United States risked isolating itself from key allies. As uncertainty loomed, the situation became increasingly volatile, with no clear resolution in sight. The breaking point: blackouts, inflation, and market panic. The crisis reached its peak when Canadian officials took the unprecedented step of significantly reducing electricity exports to the United States. The impact was immediate. Electricity prices surged across affected states, placing immense strain on residents and businesses alike. In cities such as New York, rolling blackouts became a harsh reality, disrupting daily life and causing widespread frustration among citizens. Wall Street reacted swiftly. Energy stocks plummeted as investors scrambled to assess the long-term implications of the crisis. Market analysts warned that the instability in energy trade could lead to broader economic consequences, shaking investor confidence. With industries struggling to cope with soaring costs, inflationary pressures mounted, further compounding the financial strain on ordinary Americans. Households began to feel the effects in their everyday expenses. Heating and cooling costs rose sharply, forcing families to make difficult choices. Grocery prices climbed as supply chain disruptions affected food production and distribution. For many Americans, the trade war had transformed from a political battle into a personal economic crisis. Amid the chaos, calls for immediate negotiations intensified. While some officials still clung to the hope of economic coercion, it became increasingly evident that the United States had underestimated the consequences of its trade policies. The pressure to find a resolution became overwhelming, leading to urgent discussions aimed at de-escalating the crisis. But with both nations having suffered significant economic damage, the path to a new agreement remained uncertain. Behind closed doors, the secret peace talks begin. As the trade war escalated and power grid instability loomed, both nations recognized the need for immediate action. Secret meetings commenced between Canadian and United States officials in Washington and Ottawa. Behind closed doors, representatives from both governments, along with energy and trade experts, attempted to navigate an increasingly volatile situation. The Canadian delegation, led by high-ranking ministers and policy advisors, demanded a complete rollback of tariffs before any discussion of an energy agreement. They insisted that any deal must acknowledge Canada's strategic role in supplying power to major regions in the United States. However, the United States was not willing to concede so easily. The administration, under pressure from industrial leaders and state governors, sought ways to maintain a firm stance without causing further economic damage. With industries reliant on stable energy imports, lobbyists urged the government to reach a settlement before widespread disruptions could take hold. Yet balancing public perception with diplomatic negotiations proved to be a challenge. Any concessions made behind closed doors risked appearing as political weakness. Meanwhile, the media caught wind of the talks, speculating on the nature of the discussions. Both governments issued vague statements, assuring their citizens that negotiations were ongoing, but providing little clarity on the details. Behind the scenes, officials knew they had to act swiftly. The stakes were too high, and both nations were aware that prolonged conflict would only exacerbate the crisis. The Canadian divide. As negotiations unfolded, an internal divide emerged within Canada. While many supported the government's firm response to the tariffs, some business leaders and political figures feared long-term repercussions. Major corporations with deep economic ties to the United States expressed concerns that Canada's tough stance could lead to further restrictions, isolating industries that relied on American markets. Executives from the automotive, manufacturing, and technology sectors warned that an aggressive approach could destabilize investment and lead to potential job losses. On the other side, a wave of nationalism surged across the country, with many calling for economic independence from the United States. Citizens urged their government to seek alternative markets, expand trade partnerships with Europe and Asia, and lessen reliance on the American economy. Social movements and advocacy groups emphasized the importance of self-sufficiency, pushing for increased investment in domestic energy infrastructure to reduce dependency on foreign markets. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau faced mounting political pressure from opposition leaders who questioned the sustainability of his strategy. Some argued that compromise was necessary to protect economic stability, while others supported an even firmer stance against the United States. Within his own administration, debates ensued over whether to seek a middle ground or double down on countermeasures. The Prime Minister understood that whatever decision was made would shape Canada's economic trajectory for decades to come. Offers and rejections. As pressure mounted on both sides, the United States finally extended an offer. President Donald Trump, eager to present a resolution that appeared strong and decisive, proposed a reduced tariff deal. However, the terms came with significant conditions. In exchange for lower tariffs, Canada would have to agree to specific trade concessions, including granting American companies increased access to Canadian energy markets. The deal also required Canada to commit to stricter border security measures and additional compliance regulations that favored American economic interests. Canadian officials were quick to analyze the proposal, recognizing the potential pitfalls. Accepting the deal would provide immediate economic relief, but at the cost of long-term sovereignty over key industries. The government faced a difficult decision. Agreeing to the terms could de-escalate tensions and stabilize markets, but it also risked setting a precedent for future negotiations where Canada would be pressured into concessions. Financial markets reacted sharply to the news of the offer. Wall Street investors speculated on the outcome, with energy and trade stocks experiencing fluctuations in response to the uncertainty. Canadian markets also saw volatility as businesses waited to see whether their government would accept the terms or push for a more favorable agreement. Citizens and industry leaders alike watched closely, aware that the coming days would determine the economic future of both nations. The final agreement. But who really won? After weeks of intense negotiations, a final agreement was reached. The United States agreed to reduce tariffs on Canadian imports, but Canada had to make several strategic concessions. The deal included measures that allowed American firms to participate in Canadian energy markets, albeit under regulated conditions. Additionally, Canada secured a commitment from the United States to maintain uninterrupted energy imports, ensuring stability for the millions of American households and businesses dependent on Canadian electricity. The announcement of the deal brought mixed reactions. Some viewed it as a diplomatic victory for Canada, demonstrating resilience in the face of economic pressure. Others saw it as a necessary compromise, avoiding further escalation that could have led to long-term economic consequences. The Canadian government framed the agreement as a step toward ensuring national economic security while maintaining key trade relationships. In the United States, the administration presented the outcome as a strategic win, emphasizing that American businesses had gained better access to Canadian resources. Despite the resolution, the broader implications remained uncertain. The crisis exposed vulnerabilities in both nations' economies, highlighting the risks of overdependence on any single trade partner. Canada accelerated its efforts to diversify energy exports, strengthening ties with European and Asian markets to reduce future risks. The United States, on the other hand, faced growing calls to bolster domestic energy production to prevent reliance on external sources. The long-term impact of the agreement would take years to unfold. While both countries managed to avoid immediate economic disaster, the diplomatic tensions and policy shifts set in motion by this standoff ensured that the landscape of North American trade would never be the same again. The aftermath. The energy dispute between the United States and Canada marked a turning point in their economic and political relationship. The once stable and cooperative trade partnership was permanently altered as both nations reassessed their dependency on one another. Canada, having successfully leveraged its energy exports as a tool for negotiation, began to explore long-term strategies to diversify its markets. Meanwhile, the United States faced the harsh reality that its reliance on Canadian electricity had left it vulnerable in ways previously underestimated. The fallout from this crisis forced the United States to implement new policies aimed at preventing a similar situation in the future. Investments in alternative energy sources, including solar and wind power, were accelerated as policymakers recognized the urgent need to secure domestic energy production. Federal and state governments also prioritized the expansion of nuclear power plants and natural gas infrastructure to reduce dependence on foreign energy suppliers. In Canada, political leaders doubled down on energy sovereignty, ensuring that future exports would be managed with national interests at the forefront. As a direct result of the crisis, energy independence movements gained significant traction in both countries. In the United States, calls for reducing foreign energy reliance grew louder, with some policymakers advocating for complete energy self-sufficiency. In Canada, citizens and politicians alike supported increased control over natural resources, viewing the crisis as proof that energy should not be used as a bargaining chip. This ideological shift led to stronger support for domestic energy projects and strategic alliances with nations beyond North America. Could this happen again? With the precedent set, many began to question whether this crisis was an isolated event or the beginning of a larger trend. Experts debated whether Canada could or would use energy as leverage again in the future. While Canadian officials insisted that the energy shutdown threat was a response to extraordinary circumstances, the international community took note of the effectiveness of such a strategy. For the United States, the crisis underscored the fragility of its energy security. Although policymakers rushed to implement solutions, many questioned whether these efforts would be enough to prevent a similar crisis. The country's complex energy infrastructure, built on long-standing trade agreements, could not be altered overnight. While the government promoted domestic energy expansion, some experts warned that full energy independence was an unrealistic goal given the interconnected nature of global markets. Other nations observed this crisis carefully, evaluating how energy could be used as a geopolitical tool. Countries rich in natural resources began exploring ways to strengthen their energy industries, recognizing that controlling vital commodities could serve as a powerful form of leverage. Meanwhile, governments reliant on energy imports sought to diversify their supply chains to avoid a similar fate as the United States. The global conversation surrounding energy security shifted dramatically, with nations re-examining their dependencies and vulnerabilities. As energy became an increasingly valuable geopolitical asset, countries sought to balance trade relationships, resource control, and national security in ways that had not been seen in modern history. The global energy war has begun. The crisis between the United States and Canada signaled the beginning of a larger shift in international energy dynamics. The conflict demonstrated that energy was no longer just a commodity, but a strategic weapon that could reshape global politics. Governments worldwide took notice, adjusting their policies to reflect this new reality. Several nations, particularly those with vast natural resource reserves, began leveraging their energy exports for political gain. Some countries imposed stricter trade policies, ensuring that their energy supplies would benefit their own economies before being exported. Others forged new alliances, seeking energy security through regional cooperation. The idea of energy nationalism surged, with governments prioritizing domestic needs over international trade agreements. As this shift took place, tensions rose between energy-rich nations and those dependent on imports. The crisis between the United States and Canada was just the first domino to fall. Soon, similar conflicts emerged in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Countries that had long relied on stable energy trade found themselves facing sudden price increases, supply shortages, and political ultimatums. The future of global energy stability became uncertain. International leaders met in emergency summits, attempting to negotiate fair trade agreements and prevent further economic turmoil. Yet the reality was clear. Energy was now one of the most valuable bargaining tools on the planet. Nations that controlled energy resources held unparalleled power, and those that depended on imports faced a precarious future. The world had entered a new era where access to energy was not just an economic issue, but a defining factor in global stability. The lessons learned from the crisis between the United States and Canada would shape energy policies for decades to come, as nations adapted to a landscape where power, quite literally, depended on who controlled the resources. Energy is now a geopolitical weapon, and nations must adapt before the next crisis strikes. But what does this mean for the future? What do you think? Let's know in the comments below.